Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So good to have you with us as we do our study in the book of Exodus. We'll be starting in Exodus chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at verses 11 through 15. And this is for September 29th, 2024. But you can listen to it anytime you want, even years later, should the Lord tarry. And the title is, Have You Been to the Well? Now, I could read that passage where it says in verse 11, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, that Moses had killed a slave master, when he heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. And so that's where we get the title, Have You Been to the Well? This was definitely a low point in Moses' life. And as he stared down that well, probably pretty deep, he might have been contemplating how badly his life had turned out to this point. And so he might have been to the end of himself, a time when he needed to be reinvented, a time when he needed to look outside of himself for help. Well, now, we start this in verse 11 of chapter 2. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. So here he was. He had been a little boy that had been a baby that had been pulled out of the water. And so the Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, which means to be drawn out of the water. And so he had this name, Moses. Mommy, why did you call me Moses? Son, because you were drawn out of the water. You were in a basket. And I heard you crying, and I saw you, and I decided I would pick you as my child. And so you were adopted. Meanwhile, though, for anywhere from 2 even to 5 years old, anywhere from 2 to 5 years old, he was being raised by his birth mother. He probably had Miriam and Aaron as playmates, and he grew up in the home as she nursed him, raised him, changed him, fed him, and there came a time when he was to be weaned and drawn away from the mother's milk and be on his own. He could be brought into Pharaoh's daughter's house. Now, don't discount those early years. Even if you have a child and they are taken from you at 3 years old, if you have a Christian home, chances are these children have learned how to pray. I remember now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Bless mommy and daddy. And it was a prayer I was taught by my parents, and I prayed that every night. And I didn't need to be prompted to do it. I was just taught that that's what I do, and I prayed that every night. And so children can learn to pray. Children can learn of God, and they are aware of God. They learn stories of creation and Adam and Eve. I remember as a little boy, 3 or 4 years of age, and I'd get the family Bible. It was a big old thing, one of these coffee table Bibles, and I'd look at the pictures, and I'd ask my older sister and brother, tell me about this, and they'd tell me about the story if they knew it. And so children are curious about those things, and they absorb things. I had a neighbor lady that took care of me, Angie. She was Italian. I started picking up Italian. When you're a little person, you just absorb everything. And so here was Moses. He was living in a Hebrew household. He heard about Jehovah God. He maybe was taught to pray. He watched them as they had their Friday night Sabbath service. If they, I don't know what they did. They probably didn't have it formally like that. That was after um, it was set up after the Exodus, but they might have had some type of worship. And they were Levites. And so, yeah, and I grew up myself in a Christian home. And by the time I was 3 or 4 years old, I knew all about Christmas. Oh man, I was looking forward to Christmas. And so Moses was aware of his adoption. It wasn't hid from him. He knew he had been a Hebrew child, drawn out of the water, raised by Hebrew people. That was probably his first language, was the language of the Hebrews. And Moses became then educated, probably bilingual now. He spoke whatever the Egyptians spoke, and he spoke also the Hebrew language, although you can forget it pretty fast. And so I remember there was a professor of mine, his name was Dr. Whitcomb, and his father had been a military um, general of sorts, and he was attached to China. And before the revolution, uh, he was over there. His mother was there too, and he had an Alma. And this was a Chinese lady that helped to raise him, and his native language was Chinese. Um, but he always had a soft spot in his heart for the Chinese. Whenever I would go out to eat with him, he'd want to go to the Chinese restaurant, and he'd speak some Chinese to the people. He wanted to be a Chinese missionary. It never worked out. But so here was Moses, and he was probably bilingual already. He learned reading and writing. The Egyptians were one of the earliest uh, cultures to develop writing. They started with hieroglyphics, but they also had a written language with an alphabet. And this writing, whether it be in hieroglyphics or whether it be with the alphabet that they had developed, they would write it left to right or right to left, same with hieroglyphics, or even up and down. And they didn't have the vowels in there. And so he probably learned how to read this. And you know, the Hebrew language uh, was eventually put down into writing, and he and Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He may have created the alphabet, may not have, but the Hebrew alphabet that was developed, you could read from right to left. It's different. We read left to right in English. When I was learning Hebrew, that was a little bit of a knack to catch on to that. And after a while, so it was just second nature, reading right to left. And there were no consonants in it, and all just to say consonants, no vowels in it, just like the Egyptian language had no vowels in it. And they could read right to left. Greek read left to right. So it seems to me that Moses was schooled in these things. He was certainly a prince of Egypt. born in Pharaoh's house, at least adopted into it, and he could have learned warfare and legal aspects. And by the time Moses had to flee Egypt, he was 40 years of age. And so being in the court, being around law, and seeing how things were done as a ruler, and learning the skills of warfare, and learning the skills of administration and reading and writing. And here he understood the Hebrew culture to a certain extent and the Egyptian culture. And he came to a point, doesn't say how old he was, but it says, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up. Doesn't say specifically how long that was when he had grown up, that he kind of came in himself. He had these two cultures he knew. He knew the Hebrew culture to a certain extent, he was at least aware of it. And then he had the Egyptian culture. And he knew that there was maybe one God that the Israelites worshipped, and there are many gods that the Egyptians worshipped. And so he might have come to his senses when Moses grown up that he went out to his brethren, very inexact phrase. Maybe he was near 40 years of age when he decided suddenly to start looking at things and thinking, well, but for the grace of God, I could have been a slave or even dead. And now I've been born with a silver spoon in my mouth. And yet these people who are just like me, same flesh and blood, they're enslaved and I'm free. And so he understood that he was just lucky in some sense or another, or the unseen hand of God upon him. He might even have heard that they wanted to go back to their land. And he looked on their hard labors. He was aware of how difficult their life was made. He could see them being whipped. He could see them being beaten. He could see them being deprived. Just the ugliness of all that. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he was starting to identify with these Hebrew people, and I'm sure they got to the point where he hated how they were being treated and the unjustness of it all. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So, it was one of those things where once he decided to act, there was no turning back. He couldn't just wound the man, and he murdered him. Now you can say he was saving a life. You might go to saying that. Maybe there was a mitigating circumstances. You might even say that. But I doubt that the Egyptians would see it that way. And so he thought that he had done it and nobody had seen. Well, you can underestimate how many people can see, and there was at least one other person that knew what he had done because he had spared this man's life. You think that man was going to keep his mouth shut? He talked to other people about it. And then it was the next day. He went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting. Even when you're oppressed and you're beaten down and all kinds of difficult things are happening to you, men still have trouble getting along. And so these two Hebrews were fighting. They were fighting with each other, and he said to one of the offenders, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us?" Well, the truth of the matter is, nobody had, I guess, or he was an Egyptian. Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? And all of a sudden, it struck Moses that the word was out. One day had passed, and everybody seemed to know about it. So, are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and said, surely the matter has become known. And so that was a proper assumption, because it says in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, how did he hear about this? It could have been something as simple as the man's wife or some of his cohorts saying, Isaac didn't show up to work today, or we didn't see him at the end of the day. Or the wife would have said, where's Isaac? He didn't come home last night. It's not like him. And so they'd start to investigate. Who's the last person that might have seen him? Well, he was working there by the mud pits, and it was this group of people. And so what they were going to do is they're going to start talking to them and being slaves. They beat the tar out of them and get them to say what happened. Well, they were going to find out one way or another. And I know a lot of people have seen how Cecil B. DeMille developed a story of the Ten Commandments and how there was this love affair, and Moses was 40 years old and dashing, and he took pity on the people. Some of that was accurate, some of it wasn't. Some of it was kind of made up, made for a good story. It was possible, but might not have been what actually happened in some of this instance. And they managed to get a hold of him and take him before Pharaoh. Well, we don't know that. And makes for a better story, I suppose, in some people's minds. But he heard of this matter. He tried to kill Moses. Well, back at that time, if you had murdered somebody, then you had what was called the Avenger of Blood. And it was the responsibility of the relatives to go after you. Later on, Moses had to develop a law system for the Israelites and to deal with things like this. And what would happen is the Avengers of Blood would go after you, and if you didn't flee to a city of refuge, and then they would give you a trial, and if it was an accident or something like you pushed somebody and they fell and hit their head against the rock, you didn't mean to kill them, but you were upset with them. There may be mitigating circumstances, and they would say, well, you have to stay in the city of refuge until the high priest dies. And the high priest, maybe he just came into office and he was going to live 40 years. Or maybe it was 25. But the fact of the matter is, you had to stay in that city of refuge. And this was developed by Moses. And when the high priest died, that man could leave that city of refuge and go back to his tribe of which he lived among. But if he went out sooner than that, the high priest hadn't died, the avengers of death could hunt him down and kill him, and his blood would be on his head. So there was some type of sentence for this accidental, or it was not meant to be a murder or an accident. But here Moses had actually put somebody to death, and so he fled. He fled. And I don't know if he had a horse with him, a chariot, or maybe he left by night and only traveled by night. But in a circuitous route through the Sinai Peninsula, perhaps traveling by night, going from water hole to water hole, being thirsty and hungry, and just trying to get by He managed to survive and get about 150 miles away from Egypt, and he landed in Midian. And he sat down at this well. And as he sat down at this well, uh, he could have viewed this as a low point. He went from being the prince of Egypt to a nobody, to a person just sitting by a well with no apparent future. He thought maybe he could be the deliverer. He was in a uniquely placed position. He was a Hebrew, but he was also in the royal house of Pharaoh, and he decided to risk saving one Hebrew in a moment of passion. And God put him aside. And he remembered later on when God said, I'm going to send you to be the deliverer. He said, well, who should I say has sent me? I've got no credentials. I remember that slave, perhaps in his mind, who said, who are you? Who's made you a prince or a judge over us? And he knew he had no credentials in and of himself. And the Lord said, tell them I am has sent me. And he said, here, take that staff that's in your hand, throw it on the ground, became a snake. Now pick it back up, became a staff again. Put your hand in here, became leprous. Now put it back out. And so various little things that he could do to show that God was with him because he knew he was nothing. And it says that he became the meekest man on the earth, sitting there at that well. And so it was a very low point in his life. And this happens to us all. Friends, there comes a time when we hit a low point in our life. And maybe it's not a well we're sitting by. For Jacob, he tricked his brother and took the blessing. Should have come to him anyway, but he had to trick his brother and his father. And now his brother wanted to kill him. And mom and dad said, you got to leave. We don't want to lose both of our sons. When he kills you, then we have to put him to death because he murdered you. And we don't want this. So you're going to have to go. And we are going to say in the pretext that you're going to Haran to seek a wife. And that'll be the cover story. But really, why you're leaving is because you're going to get killed. And so he left, and he hadn't ever been to that land. They didn't even know he was coming. He was traveling alone. It could be a very perilous, terrifying journey. He could get waylaid along the way. He could die of thirst. He could get hungry and faint. It was hot. Very perilous traveling. And the first night away from home, and he laid down, and for a pillow he had a rock under his head. Maybe he had a scarf or something on top, but I don't imagine it was too soft. And he tried to sleep, and it was a low point in his life. He couldn't go back home. He was going to a place he didn't know where it was exactly. He'd have to feel his way. It was a long journey, probably take him a month to get there. And so he had all this in front of him, and he didn't know what was going to happen to him. And he had this dream. And he came to the end of himself, and he said to God who had given him this dream, if you watch over me and you bring me back here, you will be my God, and I will serve you. And so it was a low point in his life. And he saw that his conniving and his plans and all that he'd prepared for really had come to nothing. And he turned to God and he called out to him. So here was Moses, he was at the well. And here was Jacob, he was at the Bethel, sleeping on a rock pillow. When he came back, some 21, 22 years later, he had wives in tow, he had sheep in tow, but here was coming his brother Esau with 300 men mounted, racing toward him, and he had to have another time where he wrestled in his mind, is God going to protect me? And God appeared to him and wrestled with him, and God could have gotten away anytime he wanted. But there was this process going on in the heart of uh, Jacob. And Jacob said, bless me. And his hip was put out of joint. And he said, I will not let go of you unless you bless me. And God had said he would. He said it at Bethel. He made a promise. I will bless you. And he worked through that. And he went forward. And Esau was all teddy bearish. Well, my friends, so Jacob had a couple times. The pillow at Bethel, the rock pillow, saw the Jacob's ladder, and then the wrestling. He got his name changed to Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. And you had David. And David, he didn't have a well, but he had a cave. His father-in-law, he'd married his daughter, Micah, and his father-in-law was jealous of him. Saul has slain his thousands, and David has slain his 10,000s. And David had slew Goliath, and Jonathan, Saul's son, and David were great friends. They'd made a pact that they would not harm each other. And now David was apparently going to be the one who was going to be king. And Saul wanted to put him to death and threw the javelin at him several times. And he was in and out of favor. I think Saul was unstable in his mind. Here was David. He had been anointed by Samuel, just as Saul had been anointed. But David was supposed to um, succeed him. David spared Saul's life a couple times, but Saul turned mean again. And Jonathan said, I'll feel my father out and see if you're back in his graces. And if not, I'll shoot an arrow at this appointed time. And if I say to the young man, go get the arrow, and if I say it's over here to your right, then you'll know that you're back in my Father's graces. But if I say it's beyond you, then you'll know that don't come back. And so he said to the young man, it's beyond you. And then he said, now take this bow and arrow and go to the city. And David just wept. He was so sorrowful that he couldn't be there and in the court and with his wife and Jonathan and all. It's a low point in his life. He fled. He got to the priest at the temple, and he said, you got any food? And he was able to give him some of the holy bread. And he gave him Goliath's sword because he didn't have any weapon. Well, the sword belonged to David because he had killed Goliath. And then he fled, and after he fled, he may have heard, I'm not sure if he had or not, that when Saul came, he killed that high priest because he had given David some food. And so, you know where David landed? He landed at Gath. Now, do you know who he slew with that sword he had with him right then? Goliath of Gath. And here was King Achish. King Achish was going to let him become a confederate with him. And some of the people said, do you know who this guy is? This guy is the one that has killed 10,000. Saul has killed thousands, and he has killed 10,000s. This is David. Are you crazy to bring this man in his house? Word got over to David, and he knew he had to act fast. And he started scribbling on everything like he was some crazy man, and he let slobber come down out of his mouth and onto his beard. And when they brought David in front of him and he was acting crazy, the man said, "Don't I have enough crazy people already in my house? Throw this man out of here." And so David got away. And so here he had escaped death from the king of Achish. The high priest got killed because of him. And Saul was trying to kill him also. And he ended up in a cave of Adullam. And my friends, it was a low time for him. And yet he wrote a psalm. He wrote a psalm when he was in the cave of Adullam, and it was Psalm 57. Let me turn it to you, and I'll read that to you. And if you read the title, Prayer for Rescue from Persecutors, for the choir director set to a certain music of David when he fled from Saul in the cave. Be gracious to me, O God, be gracious to me, for my soul takes refuge in you, and in the shadow of your wings I will take refuge. Until destruction passes by, I will cry to God Most High, the God who accomplishes all things for me. A marvelous passage. You should read it for yourself. So here was Moses. He was sitting at a well, a low point. He'd come to the end of himself, and God was going to reconstruct him. Kind of like a young man that joins the Marines. They cut off his hair. They take away his identity. His name is just a number. He's called a scumbag, and he's told that he's nothing. And then they build him up the way they want him to be built. And so here's Moses. That 40 years in the Egyptian university was now going to be balanced out by 40 years at the Sinai University, tending sheep. Jacob, his low point could have been that pillow that he had for a rock, wondering what he was going to do with his life. He wrestled with God some 21 years later, and he worked through all these things. And then David was being chased after by Saul. He loved Saul. He worked with Saul, and Saul wanted to kill him. Jonathan let him know that he shouldn't come back. He lands down there with King Akash in Gath, and he has to feign being crazy, and he escapes, and he ends up in a cave. Here he is, the anointed one of Israel, and things aren't seeming to work out. And then you have our Lord Jesus Christ. He didn't have any sin, but he did have the Gethsemane, and he sweat drops of blood. And he said, Father, if there is any way that this cup can pass from me, nevertheless not my will, but thine be done. And he faced that cross. He had sweat drops of blood, drops like blood, and he went to that cross. And my friends, we all have our low times, whether it's a disease or a reversal or a bankruptcy or a failed crop or a disease that wipes out of our herd or an accident or a firing. Any number of things can bring us to the end of ourselves, and we can wonder, is this my well? Is this my cave? Is this my rock for a pillow? And you look to God, and he reconstructs you. You call on his name. Lord, I've made a mess of my life. Lord, I can't do anything anymore. I need your help. Take this mess of my life and make something out of it to the glory of your name. And so, my friends, we all go through those things. And here was Moses going through that. We all have to go to the well. And friends, don't look down in the well. Look up. to God.